day. As previously discussed, I am out of London at the moment whilst my house is being rewired, and unfortunately this has meant that the conditions in which I'm making programs is perhaps less than optimal. One consequence of this, and also of time constraints, is that my videos are going to be shorter than usual, and I can't guarantee that I'll be able to provide updates every single day. But for what it's worth, I will continue to the extent that I can to continue to provide updates and to do programs. So where are we? Briefly, over the last couple of hours, there's been information about further Russian advances on the Ukrainian battlefronts. The British Ministry of Defence has now admitted that the Russians have made significant gains in Bakhmut. In fact, it's been one of their most pessimistic reports about the war. To date, it has no real comfort for Ukraine. It carries no real comfort for Ukraine. I will read out briefly what it says. In recent days, Russian forces have regained some momentum in the Battle of Bakhmut. Since late March 2023, their advance had largely stalled. I've never taken that seriously, but then it goes on to say Russia has made further gains and has now highly likely advanced into the town centre and has seized the west bank of the Bakhmutka River. Ukraine's key 0506 supply route to the west of the town is likely severely threatened. Russian regular forces, likely include airborne troops, have probably reinforced the area, and Russia is again using artillery more effectively in the sector. There is a realistic possibility that locally Wagner and Russian MOD commanders have paused their ongoing feud and improved cooperation. Now, just to say that, as I believe is the case in the United States, there is a certain protocol in the use of language. So when the British Ministry of Defence says that Russia has made further gains and has now highly likely advanced into the town centre and has seized the west bank of the Bakhmutka River, that is a statement of fact. Highly likely means that it is all but certain. So the British Ministry of Defence says that Russia is now in control of the centre of Bakhmut and has seized the west bank of the Bakhmutka River. When the British Ministry of Defence, however, says that the key 0506 supply route to the west of the town is likely severed, that is a slightly more qualified statement. It suggests that there's still ongoing fighting in those places. Well, in fact, we can go much further than these British reports, because these British reports, this British MOD report, actually describes the situation as it was a couple of days ago. The Russians have indeed captured the centre of Bakhmut, that they captured it several days ago. They've cut off the road, or at least they're able to shell the road. I've been talking about this for a long time, based on both Russian and Ukrainian reports, and it seems that in fact the Russians have pushed now well beyond the centre. They've captured a string of places in the more western parts of Bakhmut, and as I discussed yesterday, it seems that the circumference of the area of Bakhmut still under Ukrainian control is around 5 kilometers, which is too small an area, I think, to be defendable, given the heavy Russian artillery use and the forces that are deployed in this area, in Bakhmut itself. So it does look as if the Russians now are making very significant gains in Bakhmut indeed. Even the British Ministry of Defence is admitting it. Now, the there have been denials of the reports yesterday that the Ukrainians are pulling back from Bakhmut. And there's been more statements to that effect from Yevgeny Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner organization. He's come out and said that he's seen no sign that the Ukrainians are giving up the fight for Bakhmut. In my experience, Prigozhin again tends to say these sort of things, make these kind of comments, the kind of comments he's reported as making when on the eve of a Russian breakthrough. And I think a proper reading of Prigozhin's words is that yes, the Ukrainians are still defending and defending strongly in that part of Bakhmut that they control, but that area is shrinking by the day, perhaps even by the hour. I've been seeing all kinds of claims from Russian sources, especially about buildings and structures that have fallen under Russian control. I'm not able to verify them, and there's so many of them now that I can't really even begin to keep pace with all of these things. But anyway, the net effect of all of this is that it's clear that, as I said, this battle is coming to an end and that Prigozhin's forces are advancing. And it's likely that within a fairly limited amount of time now, assuming nothing changes, that the Battle of Bakhmut itself will be finally over. Now, Prigozhin says that the Ukrainians are holding firm. Others are saying otherwise. Our old friend, Lieutenant Colonel Marochko of the Lugansk militia, has told the Russian TASS news agency that Ukraine has transferred troops from the Bakhmut area to Liman because of significant advances that the Russians are making in that area. And by the way, and for the record, the Institute for the Study of War in the United States has now also apparently confirmed some Russian advances, not so much in Liman, but in the Kupiansk area, advances which the Ukrainian military themselves have not acknowledged, Russian advances that the Ukrainian military has not acknowledged, but which do seem to be taking place. And this is based on geolocation of information. And of course, Kupiansk is that important town on the Oskol River, somewhere north of Liman, captured just before the recapture of Liman over the course of Ukraine's Kharkov counteroffensive of the autumn. There's been fighting going on the outskirts of Liman, of Kupiansk for some time, but the Russians do seem to be making or gaining more ground around Kupiansk. And it could be that it's these advances that has obliged Ukraine to reshuffle some of its troops, to move troops from the Bakhmut area to try to hold firm in Liman and Kupiansk and that area of the battlefront. Now, someone else, another one of our regulars, Yan Gagin, who is an advisor to Denis Pushilin, the acting head of the Donetsk People's Republic, he's come out and said something different. He also says that the Ukrainians are pulling troops out of the Bakhmut area, and he says that they are transferring them to another front, but not to the one in the north, the area around Kupiansk, but rather to the area further south, that they're now trying to hold their positions near Avdiivka. And in fact, again, there have been multitude of reports about intense fighting in Avdiivka, near Avdiivka, and there was a report yesterday and early this morning, this is from Russian sources, that the Russians are now in the process of storming another important village near Avdiivka called Pervomaiskoye, and that if this place is captured, that will bring that moment of the final encirclement of Avdiivka one step closer. So pressure on Ukraine are all along the lines, the front lines. Incidentally, and going back to the fighting in Bakhmut itself, though the Russians are clearly operating and attacking hard in Bakhmut, there's also reports that they're making advances in places like Bogdanovka, large village northwest of Bakhmut itself. It's basically a part of the Bakhmut conurbation area, and I suspect that this is less intended to try to encircle Ukrainian troops. I'm not sure whether such a plan ever existed, but if it did, I think the Russians have decided that it would be too costly and complicated to achieve. I think that the purpose is to strengthen Russian positions for the further advances westward once Bakhmut itself has been captured. So that's basically a quick summary of the information from the battlefronts. Now, I'm going to say a few more things about another news story that's been circulating for some hours. There's been a release of a cache of documents, NATO documents, about the conflict. And this is an interesting release of documents. I won't pretend, I haven't had the time to study these documents in any detail myself, but apparently they give casualty numbers, which apparently derive from Ukrainian sources. The casualty numbers for the numbers of Ukrainians killed, soldiers killed, is said to be much higher than what the Ukrainians have acknowledged, to the extent that they've ever provided acknowledgements. The Russian losses are said to be significantly lower. I've seen varying figures for what these documents supposedly say about these losses. The Western media is saying that that Western governments have admitted that these are real documents which have been released, that they describe the situation as it was several months ago. I'm not sure exactly when, and that they're also giving information, however, that suggests, this is what the Western media is saying, that Russian agencies have somehow tampered with these documents and have changed some of the numbers to make the Ukrainian losses higher and the Russian losses lower than they actually are. Well, I think the last is unlikely, but as I said, as I haven't actually seen these documents yet, I'm not really going to go there and discuss them in more detail in this program. What I would say is this, and again, I'm basing this on reports of what is in these documents rather than my own reading of these documents. But they do suggest that the situation with the Ukrainian military is still somewhat chaotic. And even though these documents are several weeks old, describe a situation, as I said, that's apparently several weeks old, it does suggest that Ukraine might still not be fully prepared for a counteroffensive at the moment. In other words, that counteroffensive might still be some weeks away. Well, I'm not going to say more, and everything I've just said about these documents should be taken in a very qualified sense when I've had an opportunity to read them and to make my own assessment of them. I will no doubt return to this topic. Now, on the issue of Ukraine's offensive, yesterday, as I said, there were various reports that Zelensky, based on an interview one of his aides had given to the Financial Times might be preparing for some sort of diplomatic settlement with the Russians, which would mean ceding control of Crimea to the Russians. I made it very clear that that was not my view. I did not think that this is what Zelensky himself was saying. And in fact, today there's been a statement from Alexei Danilov, who is the Secretary of Ukraine's National Security and Defense Council, a very powerful figure in Ukraine, and in my opinion, something of a hardliner. And Danilov is reported to have said, if someone wants to see the political suicide of our president, he can make it happen. And that relates to the possibility of negotiations with the Russians. In other words, what Danilov is saying is that if Zelensky were to enter into negotiations with the Russians, he would be committing political suicide. Now, I think at one level, this is clearly intended to refute the Financial Times story, or at least to contradict the Financial Times story, or perhaps more accurately, to contradict the spin some people are putting on the Financial Times story. But I think that it is also a warning to Zelensky. I think that what Danilov is telling Zelensky, and he's doing it in a very public manner, is he's telling Zelensky, if you have any idea of starting some kind of negotiation with the Russians, forget it, because you cannot remain president if you do. You will be committing political suicide if you do. Now, how does that work? Well, to my way of thinking, that looks like a threat of some kind of a coup, because how do you remove the president of Ukraine except through a coup, unless the president himself falls ill or dies or something like that happens, and or decides to go of his own volition. So it seems to me this is quite a clear threat from Danilov, who has been, as I said, who is a notable hardliner. And it makes it, I think, absolutely clear that there is not going to be any negotiation anytime soon about the future, of seeking a future, a diplomatic settlement of the conflict. The hardliners in Kiev remain very much in control. They feel they have the backing of the United States and probably Britain. For the moment, they're not prepared to countenance negotiations. The only circumstance, I think, in which they would perhaps countenance negotiations would be in the event that the Russian forces reach the Dnieper and Kiev itself becomes threatened. And then, even then, I suspect the only negotiations that they would countenance would be negotiations rather like those which happened in March last year, which so far as the hardliners are concerned, were basically an exercise in playing for time, which is of course also true about the Minsk agreement. The Minsk agreement, Ukraine signed it without any real intention of carrying it out, again, purely as an exercise in playing for time. So I don't personally think that negotiations are pending. I don't think Zelensky is interested in negotiations or looking to negotiate. I think his advisor gave this interview to the Financial Times. He said, look, if we succeed in this counteroffensive, we might sit down and talk with the Russians, or we might go ahead and try to attack the Crimean Peninsula ourselves. But in either case, as I said, he wasn't saying anything new, and the overall thrust of his comments seemed to me to be essentially to say that Ukraine wants the Crimean Peninsula back. It will take it either by